Dziękuję bardzo. Państwo znają temat naszego panelu, znaczy Stany Zjednoczone, Europa. Czy potrzebujemy nowej architektury? Do we need a new security architecture? Ja po prostu, zanim przedstawię naszych panelistów, pozwolę sobie powiedzieć kilka słów, które jak gdyby określą ramy naszej dyskusji. I może zacznę z takich 2 albo 3 krótkich anegdot. Mianowicie pierwsza dotyczy tego, proszę? Pierwsza dotyczy tego, że tak się złożyło, że 2 te anegdoty dotyczą 1998 roku. Mianowicie wówczas Polska przewodniczyła w Organizacji Bezpieczeństwa i Współpracy w Europie i miałem wtedy kontakt, jeszcze byłem w Sztokholmie z profesorem Gieremkiem, który powiedział, że ma pewien problem, w jaki sposób zorganizować spotkanie ministerialne. Otóż ja chcę powiedzieć, że w Polsce ten problem jest odwieczny, w jaki sposób zorganizować spotkanie ministerialne z różnych powodów. Jednym z powodów jest to, że jest brak centrum konferencyjnego. I krótko mówiąc, moja sugestia była taka, żeby nie organizować tego spotkania ministerialnego, zorganizować spotkanie, w którym weźmie udział grupa niezależnych, wybitnych intelektualistów ze Stanów Zjednoczonych i z Europy, którzy zastanowią się i poradzą przewodniczącemu OBWE, którym był wtedy profesor Gieremek, jaką rolę ma spełniać OBWE w przyszłości. Muszę powiedzieć, to było doskonałe spotkanie w Konstancinie i w czasie tego spotkania zadałem profesorowi Gieremkowi takie pytanie, dlaczego on nie nada tej grupie kontaktowej, która wtedy działała w byłej Jugosławii, takiego faktycznego organu Organizacji Bezpieczeństwa i Pracy w Europie. Na to profesor Gieremek tak się zastanowił chwilę i mówi, wie pan, oczywiście chciałem to zrobić i dążyłem do tego, ale wielkie mocarstwa nie bardzo lubią wielostronne organizacje. I ja w istocie rzeczy często jestem w sytuacji, jako przewodniczący OBWE, w sytuacji upokarzającej, że czekam w przedpokoju na informacje, o decyzjach, które oni podejmują. Więc ta anegdota ma na celu zilustrowanie tego, że my często mówimy, OBWE jest zdolna, niezdolna, NATO jest efektywne, nieefektywne, Rada Europy może, nie może. Otóż trzeba sobie powiedzieć, że te organizacje nie są bytem abstrakcyjnym, one są realnym odbiciem tego, czego chcą państwa należące do tych organizacji i roli, jaką mocarstwa chcą w tych organizacjach odegrać. Druga uwaga, też w pewnym sensie jest anegdotą. W 1998 roku uczestniczyłem w uroczystości w Brukseli 50-lecia pewnej instytucji, która miała niezwykle taką wzorową organizację. Mam na myśli Unię Zachodnioeuropejską. Otóż ta wzorowa organizacja, która była świetnie przygotowana na wysoki poziom urzędników i o przyjęcie do której zabiegało wiele państw, obchodziła uroczyście 50-lecie, ale wkrótce potem zorganizowany był cichy pogrzeb, żeby nikt tego nie zauważył i w istocie rzeczy od 12 lat ta organizacja powoli tak schodziła z areny. W roku 2010 przestała w ogóle istnieć, ale jeszcze istnieje jako taki byt wirtualny, że ja zauważyłem, że na siedzibach reprezentacji przy NATO są napisy, że stałe przedstawicielstwo przy Sojuszu Północnoatlantyckim, NATO i Unii Zachodnioeuropejskiej, chociaż ta Unia już nie istnieje. Co więcej powiem, że istnieje, mam wrażenie, czy nadal istnieje, nie wiem, ale do niedawna istniała grupa parlamentarna Unii Zachodnioeuropejskiej, która organizowała, czy zgromadzenie parlamentarne to się nazywało, która organizowała spotkania. I zdaje się, że jedno ze spotkań było na wyspach Bahama. Otóż zmierzam do tego, że wielu z nas często kojarzy czy identyfikuje architekturę bezpieczeństwa z instytucjami i procedurami. Nowa instytucja, ona będzie odbiciem nowej architektury. Otóż wniosek z tego, co do tej pory powiedziałem, sprowadza się do tego, że instytucje oczywiście są potrzebne, ale instytucje petryfikują rzeczywistość. One są potrzebne dlatego, żeby coś pozytywnego, co się w pewnym procesie ukształtowało, jak gdyby zatrzymać. Na czym polega ich słabość? Że instytucje i struktury, organizacje mają charakter statyczny, a proces polityczny z natury rzeczy jest dynamiczny. I w związku z tym, jeśli te instytucje nie ulegają istotnym przekształceniom, to one stają się nieważne, są marginalizowane. I w istocie rzeczy w pewnym momencie ludzie zapominają o ich istnieniu. Ja jestem przekonany, że nie tylko w Polsce, ale w Europie bardzo wielu ludzi nie wie, czy ta Unia Zachodnioeuropejska jeszcze istnieje, czy już nie istnieje. Ale jedno jest pewne, że ona od wielu lat już była instytucją nieważną. Natomiast te instytucje, które my krytykujemy, jak NATO, Unia Europejska, one są nadal bardzo ważne. One są centrum grawitacji. I teraz mój ostatni punkt dotyczy tego, że pytanie, czy potrzebujemy nowej architektury bezpieczeństwa, w znacznym stopniu jest związane z ostatnimi propozycjami Rosji, a zwłaszcza propozycją Miedwiediewa z czerwca 2005 roku, którą on przedstawił w Berlinie. Potem była wojna z Gruzją i potem 8 października w Evian Miedwiediew przedstawił rozszerzoną wersję swojej propozycji. W rok później ukazał się taki bardzo ciekawy raport, którego autorami byli dwaj obecni tutaj nasi rosyjscy przyjaciele, Wladimir Baranovsky i Aleksander Dynkin oraz Igor Jurgens. I ja muszę powiedzieć, że lektura tego raportu była dla mnie takim sygnałem, żeby sobie zadać pytanie, co leży u podstaw, do czego Rosja w tym kontekście zmierza. Mianowicie, czy chodzi o podniesienie statusu Rosji, czy chodzi o odpowiedź na pytanie, że po 20 latach od zakończenia zimnej wojny dojrzał moment do tego, ażeby pewne procesy zostały zinstytucjonalizowane, bo te instytucje, które ukształtowane były w okresie zimnej wojny, one albo straciły rację bytu, albo są nieadekwatne do nowych potrzeb. Muszę powiedzieć, że do końca odpowiedzi na to pytanie nie mam. Jedno, co wiem na pewno, że ten dokument, który został przedstawiony 29 listopada ubiegłego roku, projekt Traktatu o Bezpieczeństwie Europejskim, on nie jest dokumentem obiecującym. Natomiast fakt, że został przedstawiony, ożywił bardzo debatę. Między innymi my zastanawiamy się nad tym, niezależnie od tego naszego panelu i na poprzednich, i prawdopodobnie w czasie ostatniego panelu będziemy myśleć o tym, w jaki sposób można wyjść z tego dylematu, że mamy w Europie nadmiar instytucji, a równocześnie brak takich, które by spełniały do końca nasze oczekiwania. I ja nie chciałbym tego swojego wprowadzenia przedłużać. Sądzę, że w jakiejś części odpowiedź na to pytanie, dlaczego tak się dzieje, znajdziemy w wypowiedziach panelistów i w czasie dyskusji. I zacząłem od tego, żeby w kolejności alfabetycznej udzielić głosu jako pierwszemu profesorowi Wladimirowi Baranowskiemu, który jest zastępcą dyrektora Instytutu Gospodarki Światowej i Stosunków Międzynarodowych IMEMO Rosyjskiej Akademii Nauk. Jest bardzo wybitnym znawcą problematyki bezpieczeństwa i ci, którzy nie czytali, to polecam. Mianowicie 12 lat temu, wciąż wracam do tego 98 roku, ukazała się jego książka pod jego redakcją pod tytułem Russia and Europe, The Emerging Security Agenda. Muszę powiedzieć, że minęło 12 lat i ktoś ode mnie tę książkę pożyczył, ona znikła, więc napisałem do Oxford University Press, otrzymałem egzemplarz, znaczy jeszcze jest niewyczerpana. Polecam. Ta książka nadal zachowuje swoją aktualność. Bardzo proszę, wam słowo. Господин Baranovsky.
Thank you, Professor Rotfeld, for this introduction and for advertising my book. I will certainly send it to you, especially since it was you who was the initiator of this book and of this project, which was made at the time when you were a director of CIPRI, and I had the privilege to work at CIPRI for several years and to profit from your guidance and especially from the possibility to share with you all kind of approaches, ideas. We had really very interesting discussions, and I still profit from them. I didn't have a privilege of being very close to Bronislaw Geremyk. I met him on a few occasions in conferences and in some discussions. I followed what he wrote, I followed what he did, and I have in this respect to say two things about the appropriateness of having this conference which is devoted to the memory of Bronislaw Geremyk. I think that first of all, this was a person who had a vision concerning broader European development and broader international developments. And secondly, what is very important, that he tried and was able to put together conceptual vision and practical requirements concerning the development in Europe. And this second aspect, I think that this is of particular importance when we are discussing issues like European security or Euro-Atlantic security, what we are supposed to discuss today. Because we need both things. We need a serious conceptualizing of the issue, but what is absolutely important, it is to put this conceptual approach into practical context. Because sometimes when we forget to do it and we just lack the ability to do this, then we could have problems, both conceptual and practical. So coming back to the question which is raised for this panel. It's formulated in a very challenging way. Europe and United States, do we need a new security architecture? And when I was thinking, if I'm able to give a very short answer to this, I was a little bit hesitant. You can guess between yes and no how to answer to this question. So after all these hesitations, I nevertheless, with a risk of simplification, I would answer to this basic question, yes. My basic answer is yes, but my more developed and more substantial answer is that this yes should be followed by a lot of clarifications, but a number of clarifications with respect to all basic elements of the question which is raised. We have to clarify what we understand by security when we raise this question. We have to clarify what we understand by architecture when we raise a question of a new security architecture for Europe. We have to clarify what we mean when we speak about new security architecture. What is the difference between the new security architecture and what exists or which used exists until recently. And finally, we have to clarify what we mean by speaking about the area of application of this notion. Because the title of the panel is Europe and United States. What we actually have in mind? Do we need the security architecture where Europe and United States participate, and what we understand by Europe in this context? So let me start with the last issue, Europe and United States. Usually, and this has already been mentioned during today's discussions, there is a traditional approach. We are speaking about transatlantic relationship, and we are speaking about relationship between the United States and Europe. What is usually meant is relationship within NATO, or in a broader sense, relations between the United States and a western part of Europe. And we could continue to do this. I think that it's still a very appropriate approach. There are problems, there are issues, there are challenges when we are speaking about relationship within NATO and relationship between Western Europe and United States, although there are also some new things, and they are not minor things. Europe has become broader. Western Europe has moved in the Eastern relations, and Western Europe is more and more associated with Europe as a whole, but not all Europe. Not all Europe. So the question is to which extent we should consider European-American relations with having in mind this broader understanding of Europe. So my point is the following. Transatlantic relation, it is something which should be considered, which should be followed, which should be analyzed, and there are still a lot of questions, traditional and new questions about defense sharing, for instance, between Europe and United States, or about decision-making in NATO, or about relationship between NATO and European security and defense policy, or what the EU is doing in this aspect. But I think that alongside with this traditional approach, what is absolutely necessary is to have the broadened approach. Broaden approach when we are speaking about security in this area, and this broaden approach, I think, is best represented by the notion of Euro-Atlantic security. Euro-Atlantic security, which would create a kind of an image, with Europe being in the center of this image, United States on its western margin, and Russia on the east. It's certainly a very simplified vision, because we should not disregard Canada, or we should not disregard other former Soviet Union countries, Caucasus, but schematically, there are three elements in this Euro-Atlantic vision, Euro-Atlantic security. It is, instead of our two-headed eagle, I should say it's a kind of a vision of three components Euro-Atlantic reality, three components Euro-Atlantic entity, and this is something which seems to me absolutely necessary in order to have an adequate vision of the future developments with respect to security in this area. It's important to point on these elements, because there are approaches which would actually be ready to eliminate or to marginalize both American and Russian component in this vision. In Russia, there are still people who would consider that the United States is not to be an organic part of this security architecture. In United States, as we all know, there is a tendency of disengagement from Europe, but also with respect to Russia, there are a lot of arguments. Not all of them are very superficial. A lot of arguments according to which there could be at least questions about Russia's organic participation in this architecture. And I think that there is an interesting trend, an interesting phenomena that both with respect to Russia and with respect to the United States, there are similar lines of arguments that could be developed in this respect. The question is how to prevent disengagement of both these participants, both Russia and the United States, and the question is how to ensure their constructive engagement into the security development in the area where the traditional Europe is a central element. That second issue, it's about security. I think that this has already been said, and I think it's very important to differentiate, at least analytically, between traditional security and some new vision, new understanding, and new problems of security. Traditional security has not disappeared. There are three traditional aspects: security within the area about which we are speaking, and this is usually addressed by the notion of collective security pattern. There is security, the problematic of security with respect to domestic developments in states, and we have this when we have to deal with separatism or the issues of sustainability of states in its domestic development. And there is also a traditional aspect concerning eventual external threats. And this is usually dealt with by the notion of a common defense pattern. So all these three traditional aspects have to be dealt with. All three dimensions deserve attention, but we know that in practical development there is a considerable change. there is a considerable change, especially in the post-Cold War era. Collective security becomes a norm for most of Europe, not for all, but for most of Europe in Karl Deutsch's sense of security community. The relevance of external security is decreasing. And Europeans are getting closer and closer to a new generation of defense reviews in practical policy, where they would say goodbye to the traditional Cold War approaches. The example we have seen yesterday, for instance, is debate in the United Kingdom about deterrence, about nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is something which is inherited from the traditional security approach. It is something which is being reconsidered or shall be reconsidered. Even in Russia this happens with all traditionalism of Russia's thinking. We have had debate about military reform for more than 10 years, and this was a very controversial and not very future-oriented debate, but there is a development which would allow us to say that even in Russia, in this area, there are changes and there will be more significant changes. So with respect to all three dimensions of this traditional approach, we have not to disregard them, but to understand that their role is diminishing. And there are new security challenges which have already been mentioned. We do not have time to deal with them in a very significant way, but it's a long list of new security challenges that have to be addressed, that have to be dealt with, and they could be dealt with in the context of this Euro-Atlantic security approach, just because this can be done more efficiently than without this trilateral Euro-Atlantic pattern. Now, next issue, what we have in mind when we are speaking about architecture and when we are speaking about a new pattern for the security approaches. Do we need a new pattern? My answer is yes, as I have already said, but only insofar as the old pattern does not respond to all these challenges. We have new challenges, and we know as a traditional pattern failed to respond to quite a number of issues. We can have a list of those failures, and this list will include Kosovo. This list will include all the traditional developments in the former Yugoslavia. This list will include the war in Caucasus and many other issues. So we have, in this respect, we have to think about new patterns, but this is something which I would like to stress. We have to develop these new patterns, new approaches, new maybe institutions or a new mechanism, but not at the expenses of the old one, not at the expenses of the traditional one, not instead of the traditional one. You know, some people, well, in my country, they would be ready to propose this radical approach. Let's eliminate all the traditional things which have proved not to be very constructive, and let's do something new. Let's create something new. It's a traditional Bolshevik approach. The idea is that we have to avoid to be too radical. We have to see, and this is important, what has not worked and why this hasn't worked, why this institution haven't worked, and what was lacking on the level of the ability of the countries to operate within these traditional patterns. And we have to keep all what worked, all what was useful and could be useful in the future. You know, there are some ideas about these new patterns. I'm not very happy with some of those ideas which even were suggested by Russia. Russia, for instance, when developing this idea of Medvedev proposal, there were several points which were formulated by the Russian side that we have to increase the role of judicially binding agreements. Or, for instance, we have to focus upon the idea of indivisibility of security. Or, for instance, we have to focus upon hard security at the expenses of the soft security, and all other things. You know, there are questions about all these approaches. There are questions about all these elements which do exist, which were presented in the official Russian proposals. They have to be debated, and they have probably to be reconsidered. Like, for instance, judicially binding agreements. It is something which has, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, it is something which has to work. How can you make a judicially binding agreement and to make some big country to do what this country would not like to do? That's a big question, and you know that this is a question for international politics in general. But we do need something new. We do need something new. For instance, we have to think, and it is a conceptual but also practical thing, we have to think what would strategic stability imply for the European developments. What would strategic stability imply if you take, for instance, traditional Thomas Schelling's approach to strategic stability? It is something which does not provoke arms race. It is something which does not provoke crises. It is something which, if crisis emerge, does not provoke escalation of this crisis. It is something which we really lacked when we had the war in the Caucasus. If we retrospectively analyze what happened 2 years ago in the Caucasus, it was exactly the violation of all these ideas, the violation of all this principle of strategic stability. So this is something which has to be addressed when we are thinking about Europe. But in addition, we also have to address some existential problems. Existential problems, that means which do not necessarily are the results of the clash of interests, but have a deeper character. For instance, the issue of transfer of natural resources. I'm trying to formulate this in a very non-challenging way, but this is a big issue. This is a big issue, and we knew that this was at the origin of quite a number of problems in Russia's relations with Europe, and Russia's relations with Ukraine and Belarus, and this is something broader which has to be addressed very cautiously, without radicalism, but which something which could create problems in the future. Or it's another aspect, existential aspect, how the efforts of countries in the area of security building are perceived by other countries. Well, this is something which is proposed in the Russian draft of treaty for European security, something which I believe is not workable. It's a non-stat proposal, but there it is said that any country who is a member of this new European security treaty, if this country considers that something is a matter of concern for its security, so the issue could be raised, we could convene an international conference, and we could invite all the participants of this treaty to address this issue. I think it's a non-workable proposal. It's a non-workable proposal, but the problem is there. How it's a matter of perception, how efforts of one country are perceived by other countries, also in terms of security. There is a big traditional issue, the relationship between the principle of territorial integrity and the right of people for autonomy, for independence, and we all know what this means, and we all know that there are no radical approaches and radical solutions for this. But this is still a problem within the European context. There is also a big issue to which extent it is possible to influence the domestic developments in some of the European countries. This was raised today when we had at the previous sessions the discussion about the export of democracy. So democracy has not to be exported, but it can be supported. But the question, as we all understand, the question is how it can be supported, to what extent it can be supported, by what means it can be supported. The big debate about Ukraine and the big uneasiness in Russia about Ukraine as a previous stage of the development of this country was exactly that this was perceived in Russia, or was presented by some political forces in Russia as a case of a flagrant violation of this non-interference into domestic development. This was perceived or presented as an attempt of the West, attempt of United States, attempt of the European Union, attempt of Poland to influence the domestic developments in Ukraine at the expenses of the Russian interests. So there is a big issue about this relationship between non-interference into domestic developments and the right of interfering, the right of influencing the domestic developments. So we have this. So we have a number of other existential issues that have to be addressed within the context. And the last point, this is the last thing which I would like to mention, the very notion of architecture. I think it's I like the idea, initially I like the idea of this Russian proposal, new security architecture, and even I wrote about this, as you mentioned. But I think that on the other hand, the very word, the very notion of architecture looks as something which lacks flexibility, which has a meaning of something rigid. Well, here we have architecture. It's architecture, it's a building, it is something which has been developed, was erected, and it's very difficult to think about the notion of flexibility with respect to the notion of architecture. I think that what we need is something more flexible, more volatile, more able to react to the challenges. And my understanding of the European architecture, new security architecture for Euro-Atlantic area is the following. This should be a multidimensional phenomena. It should be a process rather than some kind of a rigid institution. It's not something which should be built upon one single institution or one single treaty. There should be a variety of different approaches, different processes, different ideas, and different mechanisms. And in this new security architecture, we should rely upon various things. We should rely upon traditional institutions, those which exist, including, first of all, NATO and European Union. We should, and the OSCE. We should, secondly, perhaps think seriously about reforming some of the elements of these traditional institutions within the OSCE, for instance. I believe that there is a considerable potential for reforming this in order to address these new elements. And thirdly, we should also keep in mind the possibility of building some new elements, some new institutions, some new patterns, especially when dealing with those new security challenges which I briefly mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this very conceptual and, in fact, intellectually provoking presentation. I was really impressed much more about the suggestion what should be a kind of the organizing principle for the system, as that you were not focused on the institutions and procedures, but rather I would say something what has to be presented for the broader public in the context of existing institutions which could be adapted to the new needs. Now I would like to present and introduce Sir Passy, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria and introduced Bulgaria to NATO. Professionally, I noticed from his CV that he is professionally chairman. And I would like to say that he served as a chairman in office of the OSCE, chairman of the UN Security Council, chairman of Foreign and Defense Parliamentary Committees, chairman of Transparency and Accountability Committee. I will stop it because time is limited. And my intention is to say that, in fact, I have forgotten at the beginning to say that panelists, they have unlimited time, but not longer than 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you very much for your generous introduction. And I would like to thank very much all the organizers for this memorable event. Like Vladimir, I did not have the privilege to work very close with Professor Geremek. We met several times under his both ministerial and non-ministerial incarnations. And I can assure you that he was a very, very impressive personality who was something like a legend among the foreign ministers between 2001, 2005, and I'm happy to see at least 3 Polish ministers here in this room who had obviously the privilege to work much closer with him. And congratulations for the people who decide to establish the foundation in his name. I think that this is a very, very forward-looking example. We were invited here to give our personal answers to the question, Europe and the United States, do we need new security architecture? And each of us will give his own or her own answer. My answer to this question is yes, many times yes. First, do we need new architecture between the West and China? Yes, we need. Do we need new security architecture between the West and Russia? Yes, we need. Do we need new security architecture between the West and the West, between EU and NATO? Yes, we need. Do we need new architecture inside the European Union? Yes, we need. I will start from the European Union. A couple of minutes ago, Bernard noticed that Professor Dinkin did not mention the European Union in his expose. It was not the fault of Professor Dinkin. The European Union is not enough visible. That's why it was not mentioned. Actually, the European Union is much more visible from inside than from outside. We who are inside the European Union tend to not to look too much beyond our own walls. The Lisbon Treaty says that the European Union should become a global actor. This is a very, very nice wish, and I would hope and would be ready to give my full support to this noble cause. But let's see, can we act on like global actor on big or small questions? One relatively simple case, which is the case of Kosovo, proves that we cannot act as one actor, let alone global actor. Another example, take for example the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula, which is a global question, a question where all global powers are present, the United Nations Security Council, the United States, Russia, China, Korea, Japan, through the six-party talks, 17 other nations through a resolution of the Security Council, including Greece and Turkey, Canada and Australia. Everybody is there, but not the European Union. I belong to a small group which is trying in the last 3 years to convince the European Commission to adopt a new fresh policy vis-à-vis the Korean Peninsula, and I have to assure you that our success is very, very limited. Actually, there is no success. Another very interesting question on which is a test for whether the European Union could be a global actor. This is the reform on the Security Council. Or at least not the whole Security Council, not the whole reform of the United Nations system. Just one very simple question. Who would be the new permanent member on the Security Council? Is this the European Union as such, or one more member state of the European Union? We cannot agree on that. How do you believe that we could become a great power without agreeing on basic, fundamental questions of foreign policy? Another very important question on which we have to solve before becoming or while becoming a global actor. This is the common European defense policy. The Lisbon Treaty widely opens the door for the European EU common defense policy. It requires 9 countries which to initiate these policies, but where are these 9 countries? We have it on paper, but we don't have it in fact. And in the same time, the European Union is spending over €500 billion for defense purposes, of which spending only 20% are efficient. 80%, according to a report of the European Parliament, not my report, the report of the European Parliament, 80% of this money is waste of money. How can we improve this? Of course, we can solve the different questions in different, through different means, but one possible approach is to reduce the consensus principle as far as foreign policy is concerned. If we reduce the consensus principle within the European Union, it will open the door for a number of good decisions to follow. Or on the big issues like the common defense policy, it could be a decision of the three biggest countries in the European Union. If they say, we make it, we shall make it. Or if we want to make the European Union more visible in future and not to be forgotten by Professor Dinkin, we could adopt a common EU energy policy. This is something that we desperately need. Each of the EU member states has its own policy with Russia on energy, and coming from Bulgaria, I can prove that this is one of the most difficult questions in our foreign relations, because our foreign relations with Russia at this moment are only energy relations. We don't have other type of foreign relations with Russia. And maybe Bulgaria is one of the very few countries in the world which can host American military bases and in the same time keep excellent relations with Russia. But nevertheless, the energy dispute between Russia and us is something that I don't wish anybody else to have. Number two, NATO-EU. We desperately need new type of relations between the European Union and NATO. Actually, there is no relations between the European Union and NATO. If you Google the documents of the European Parliament from the last 15 years, you will see that NATO is the word which is least mentioned of all other global actors. You can find 1,000 times of Russia, of China, of whatever else important factor in world politics, but no NATO. So we need a we have NATO-Russia Council, we have NATO-Georgia Commission, NATO-Ukraine Commission, but we need NATO-EU Council. We need it. We need it to improve our relations, or at least to establish our relations. I'm very happy that in this room we have at least 3 people who had who put their personal input on the next NATO's strategic concept. These are Adam Rotfeld, Hans-Friedrich from Ploetz, Steve Flanagan. If I'm forgetting someone, excuse me. They prepared an excellent document, and one colleague from Britain, Ian Davis, suggested that we ratify this document through the European parliaments, the national parliaments. I'll be ready to make one step forward. Let us propose this document to be ratified by the European Parliament, because this new strategic concept of NATO is 80% about security of Europe. 80% about security of Europe, and the European Parliament cannot neglect this fact. Russia, number 3. Do we need new security architecture with Russia? Yes, we need, not only with Russia. We need with all PFP member states. And the historic London Declaration of NATO of 1990 for the first time said that the Soviet Union, later Russia, is not anymore enemy of NATO. This is this was the pride of Manfred Wörner. He said, during my tenureship, the Soviet Union stopped to be enemy of NATO. Well, today, 20 years later, we know that Russia is not our enemy. How shall we treat it? We have to treat Russia like, in the next 20 years, like our future ally. So NATO should propose to all PFP member states, including Russia, but not only Russia, membership action plan. Russia is big and huge, and the membership action plan for Russia could be 20 years from now, or for Ukraine could be 15 years from now, but there are much smaller countries like, say, Finland or Sweden, for whom the membership action plan could take 2-3 years at max. And there will be one very positive outcome of this. This will be that, OSCE and NATO will one day merge, and this will be a great contribution to reducing international bureaucracy. China. China is a global actor, and if we want NATO to become the real subcontractor of the United Nations or of the Security Council vis-a-vis world security, we need a new type of relations with China. In particular, we need a kind of relations that we have with Russia at this moment, and to establish something like NATO-China Council. Am I over with my time?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. You will have an opportunity to respond.
I'm not going to talk about Turkey and the relations between NATO and the Islamic world.
That's exactly what you will have an opportunity to say, responding to the questions.
But this will be...
I will raise that question and you will respond.
A ready response to a question which is even not asked.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Hans. Hans, in fact, there is no need to introduce you. I remember that some years ago, it was here in 2004, Henry Kissinger, and I didn't want to say what kind of functions. In introducing him, I said, Henry Kissinger, there is no need to introduce, and he said to me, some compliments will not be redundant. And I would like to say that in your case, for those who did not cooperate with you, it has to be mentioned that you served as Secretary of State at the German Foreign Ministry and Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and permanent representative to NATO, as I remember also Ambassador to Russia. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel, for inviting me to this conference and for your words of introduction. Professor Geremek is a hero in Germany, a hero for having changed the political face of Europe, and for having substantially and essentially contributed to German-Polish reconciliation. And we owe to him a lot, and I'm very happy that I had the privilege to meet with him when he was minister and later on. Alexander Dinkin just left the room. I'm not sure that you noticed, he mentioned in his introductory remarks one Russian who is a total non-hero in Russia. Alexander Yakovlev, the man who was behind the idea of perestroika and glasnost, and unlike Gorbachev, he knew that the system was unreformable. So he was ready for the big change, and that's what I experienced in my years in Moscow. One of the most hated figures of politics in Russia in the 90s.
He served as predecessor of Alexander Dinkin in this Institute of World Economy and International Relations, and maybe that's the reason that the spirit in this institute is still.
It may well be. I had the privilege to meet him, and thus to understand what a dramatic internal fight took place in the Soviet Union in the last period, and how these actors who wanted reform, who wanted to make Russia a different country, were under physical threat and incredible pressure. So I'm very happy to have heard that a man like Sasha Dinkin pays tribute to Alexander Yakovlev. I was a little bit worried about the gloom which governed this morning's discussion prior to this panel. You may remember 1989, 1990. What were the think tankers saying about the new world? Were they looking forward to what was coming? Not at all. Not at all. People were very worried to see the perspective of German unification. That is a return to the past. We have seen it all. Need I go on? Well, there was one threat perception which was not unreal, as the Yugoslav case shows. That was a return of old differences between ethnical groups, nationalities, borders should be changed again, and all that. In that environment, I think both European Union and NATO served as organizations of extremely successful preventive crisis management. And so I don't agree with the basic assumption that we were not up to the challenges. I was one of the people who developed the concept of European Union's Eastern enlargement. I have to tell you, it was not very popular. It took a lot of political energy and later on of money and political will to bring it about. When I was at NATO in the years 88 to 93, the period when everything changed, one day the Hungarian representative turned up, said, I have to talk to you confidentially. He produced a map of Hungary with conflict at every border and was expecting that I would say, NATO will help you. And my answer was, if you feel encircled by your neighbors, aggressive neighbors, you will not find any sympathy or support neither here at Evere nor at Charlemagne. This almost, it was a very offensive way of dealing with things you could explain. And yet, the price of joining NATO and the EU, don't forget that, brought people to their senses. So now we have an absolutely unique atmosphere of security and stability in Europe we have never seen. And when, as a member of the group of experts, I was invited to go to the Baltic states, to Poland and Czech Republic, to discuss our thoughts about the new strategic concept, I always asked one question. When you compare your security status today with that you had in 1999 when we did the last strategy concept, how does it compare? And one head of state said, and that is more or less what others said with other words, in 1,000 years of our history, we have not been safer. Now, when we left the room, the colleagues of that president said, don't take him too seriously, he is not a historian. So I would just want to agree with Dan Fried when he, and with Steve Flanagan, when they both introduced into our gloomy debate a little bit of a sense of reality. So what we want to preserve when we talk about security architecture is this fundamental American-European alliance called NATO, which makes the United States a European power. What has it which is so valuable? I'm not talking so much about outside threats, but about us and our history. this alliance has brought it about that the military factor is absent from our relationship to each other. The Belgians are not worried that the Bundeswehr is too big. They're worried that it might become too small. You all know history, and I guess in Poland there may be similar feelings. So this is a unique achievement in European history. And the question I have asked myself is, can we, step by step, broaden this happy status to the rest of Europe? In that sense, a demilitarization of relations among Europeans, which is a fundamental stabilizing factor for the European continent and far beyond. Now, the issue of reassurance, which was raised in the strategic concept between Polish side and other countries, could be well served, this interest, if we made progress in introducing strong and working principles of military predictability in the territory east of NATO, including Russia. This might well be in the long-term interest of Russia, because they have a budget problem too, among other things, but they have also a great interest to have a good and trusting relationship with the European Union for the reasons which have been mentioned before. So these things are an interplay. And I would say, as far as architecture is concerned, NATO is there and will be there, although the one point which needs careful attention is how to keep the Americans in. And the European Union will be there, and it will overcome the present, what Mark Leonard called sclerosis. We have had crises. It is up and down, and I don't believe in architecture and security. Security organizations have always been the product of management of crisis and conflict. That was the reason why NATO came into existence, and we will make real progress in terms of doing what we should do anyway when we are challenged. I'm sorry to say that. The think tankers who want to construct a harmonious building with balances and pillars and all that, I think it's very fruitful to listen to them and to get ideas, but the world doesn't operate that way. So I think this is enough to support what my colleagues here have said. I think they were brilliant.
Thank you very much. Mamy 3 bardzo różne prezentacje za nami panelistów, które moim zdaniem każdy z nich skłania do myślenia. Ja chciałem powiedzieć, że mamy w tej chwili nie więcej niż 20 minut, ponieważ Volker Rie, który będzie brał udział w następnym panelu, musi odlecieć. Samolot nie będzie na niego czekał. W związku z tym ja bym poprosił, żeby bardzo być zdyscyplinowanym w stawianiu pytań i wypowiedzi. A ci, którzy będą chcieli koniecznie zabrać głos, to będą mogli zabrać głos w ostatnim panelu, któremu będzie przewodniczył pan minister, senator Władimir Cimoszewicz. Proszę bardzo, teraz kto chciałby zabrać głos? The floor is open. No? Dan, you have the floor.
I liked very much what our Russian colleagues have had to say today. There's a lot in what they said with which we could work, and in my old job, I would be following up. But there was a lot that was not said. The consequences of the war in Georgia are still with us. And it's hard to start thinking about a new architecture, as President Medvedev has proposed, when Russia has suspended some of the old architecture, like the CFE treaty. Those aren't insolvable problems. I don't believe in insolvable problems, else I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. But these are serious issues. And a second uvaga is a complaint about what Ambassador von Ploetz said, because he's taken away what I was going to say later this afternoon. And I'll just sound like I'm repeating him, but I completely agree with the point about the success of the past 20 years. And I'll say more about that later.
Thank you very much. Ja mogę powiedzieć, że jest komentarz krótki, że w ogóle jest bardzo trudno powiedzieć coś nowego. Już wszystko zostało powiedziane. Problem polega tylko, że powiedzieć inaczej, innymi słowami. Tak. Bardzo proszę, pani tutaj chciała zabrać głos.
Katya Glot, freelance political analyst from Minsk, Belarus. My question would be to Mr. Baranovsky. I'm wondering whether you could say a couple of words about such Russian initiative as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or DKB, whether how do you see its place or role in the new security architecture? Does it belong there at all? And how would you assess its potential, its capabilities of becoming a full-fledged military and defense organization, at least maybe on the post-Soviet base? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kto jeszcze chciałby zabrać głos? Bardzo proszę, pan minister Onyszkiewicz.
W Europie, jak to już było powiedziane, jest strasznie dużo rozmaitych instytucji działających w sferze bezpieczeństwa. Samo NATO przecież nie jest wyłącznie organizacją sojuszu obronnego, ale jest obudowane całym szeregiem rozmaitych takich instytucji, w których spotykają się rozmaite kraje. I chciałbym się spytać, czy w ogóle jest jakaś przyszłość przed na przykład Radą Partnerstwa Atlantyckiego. Czy tutaj nie można by było coś pomyśleć i czy nie można by było jakoś sprawić, żeby Rada NATO-Rosja, w której pokładano tak wielkie nadzieje, stała się czymś rzeczywistym, miejscem rzeczywistego dialogu, a nie tylko w takim miejscem, gdzie się wymienia informacjami, ale w których nie następuje rzeczywista dyskusja z Rosją na ważne tematy bezpieczeństwa.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę, pan poseł Marek Borowski, marszałek.
Dziękuję bardzo. Marek Borowski, Sejm. Ja mam pytanie do pana profesora Baranowskiego. Mianowicie Mołdawia ogłosiła ostatnio taki rodzaj święta, powiedziałbym, chociaż smutnego, mianowicie Dzień Pamięci Okupacji Sowieckiej. Rosja dzisiejsza odcina się od tych praktyk przecież sowieckich, od tego totalitaryzmu, od tłamszenia aspiracji narodowych, a jednak zaraz po tym taki inspektorat sanitarny rosyjski natychmiast odnalazł jakieś bakterie w winie mołdawskim i w związku z tym bardzo silnie uderzyło to w gospodarkę, bo taka ona jest po prostu mołdawską. Jak w takich warunkach budować wspólną architekturę bezpieczeństwa? To jest jedno pytanie, a drugie już bardzo krótkie do pana Passy, jeżeli tak się wymawia pańskie nazwisko. Passy. Passy. Czy mógłby pan dokończyć to, co pan mówił? Dobrze? Dziękuję.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czy są jeszcze jakieś inne pytania? Tak. Ja nie widzę. Ja mógłbym, żeby wesprzeć pana marszałka Borowskiego, to mogę powiedzieć, że jak mieliśmy w Moskwie to spotkanie grupy do spraw trudnych i wtedy wstąpiłem do restauracji gruzińskiej i oczywiście poprosiłem o wino gruzińskie. Powiedzieli, że nie ma, w Moskwie nie ma wina gruzińskiego. Ja mówię, naprawdę nie ma? Ten kelner się nachylił i powiedział, oficjalnie nie ma, ale ja panu podam w greckiej butelce gruzińskie wino. ja proponuję, żebyśmy teraz przeszli do takich dwóch uwag końcowych i może zaczniemy od Solomona Passy, a potem Władimir Baranovsky.
First, to finish on what I could not say before. The NATO-China Council is, I think, very important because this will give additional link between NATO and the United Nations Security Council. And if you ask why China and not India, or why China and not Brazil, the answer is very simple. Neither India nor Brazil are at this moment members of the Security Council. Permanent members of the Security Council. And we need a new type of relationship between NATO and the Security Council. What, however, NATO needs, first of all, this is a new image. NATO has terribly bad image. This is the sharpest contrast in the world between what one organization is doing and how this organization is perceived. There is no other organization in the world which enjoys such a sharp contrast in perception. That's why I believe that, and the public opinion, this is the strongest ally of any organization. If you have the public opinion on your side, you could do a number of other things much easier and much easier. To Minister Oniszkiewicz, who answered the question about the Partnership for Peace, is it exhausted? I think my personal answer is the following. If we offer the current PFP members membership action plan, say between 2 and 20 years span in future, we can open room for new PFP members coming from North Africa or from other neighboring parts of the world. So this is an ongoing process, and I don't believe that it will exhaust its logic.
Thank you very much. And now, Vladimir Baranovsky, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have a number of questions, and I will we do not have much time, so I have to respond in the logic, yes or no. Okay, very shortly and very quickly. About Georgia, well, I can tell that I expected that when the war there started, I thought that it's going to be a serious stumbling block for Russia's relations with the West. I was wrong. Whether for good or for bad, I just put aside this issue. But we had, for instance, the Tavigliani report of the European Union, which is a fantastic diplomatic document, which was acceptable both for Russia and for Georgia. And I think it's a very unique thing. Well, however, I think that when thinking strategically, I think perhaps it's good that we were able to overcome this problem and not to make it a big issue which would undermine everything in Russia's relations with the West. But certainly I understand that the price of this war is also very high in terms of Russia's prestige, attitude towards Russia, although there are different opinions about this inside Russia. At least I want to report to you so that you know that some people in Russia say, okay, look, we should be more tough with respect to what we consider necessary. They will accept it. They will accept it. They will have to deal with Russia as a rising power, at least a power which has its own interest, its own sphere of interest, which will be able to operate as it considers necessary, rather than follow the instructions from the West. There is this approach as well. Just we should keep this in mind also. Secondly, I agree completely with what Don Fried said about the necessity to assess properly what was done in the European context. Many people in Russia would have a very skeptical assessment about OSCE, for instance. This is something which belongs to the past, something which inherited from the past. I think that we are wrong when we are saying this. There are some elements which are important, which could be promoted, like conflict management in terms of early warning with respect to conflict, and some procedures which actually are proposed in the Russian draft on European security the Russian draft of the new European Security Treaty, many of these things, they do exist within the OSCE. The question is why these procedures haven't worked properly. But this is not the institutional problem. It's a problem of political will and political attitude, political strategy of the participating party. To the question on the CSTO, collective security treaty organizations. Just a couple of things to say. Well, first, certainly many perceive this organization as a structure which is dominated by Russia, which is partly true, but not 100% true. At least do not forget that Moscow failed. Moscow has failed to make its partners, its allies within CSTO, to recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, although Russia tried to do this. So it's not necessarily 100% as a client of Russia, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a kind of a multilateral structure, not very efficient, sometimes only symbolic, but something which probably could operate in some areas of the post-Soviet space. Let me, you know, the only structure which could provide some forces, some armed forces, perhaps with respect to eventual conflicts. We had recently something what happened in Kyrgyzia, and so we still do not have answers how we should react to such kind of situations. CSTO is a structure with its collective forces, collective security forces, which could be created, which have started to be created inside CSTO, something which could be operational in terms of addressing the issues of conflict or some kind of situation similar to what happened in Kyrgyzia. About Russian NATO Council, I think that this is the structure which has a future and should have a future, but this could operate in different contexts. This could be a place of dialogue, which is good. Dialogue is much better than the absence of dialogue. Some Russians would suggest that this could be not only a place for a dialogue, but also a place where decisions are taken. And there are some people who would say, listen, let us organize things in such a way that all decisions about peace enforcement, for instance, or about the military forced reaction to some kind of unclear situation inside the European area could be taken on the level of Russian NATO Council. It's too radical. It's too radical, but you understand that what is behind this idea is to raise the role of Russia, to make Russia equal to NATO. But it's a debatable issue, but at least I think that what is important here to have in mind, it is that the Russian attitude, so the Russia National Council, with all criticisms which we have in our country about this structure, that basically it's a positive attitude. There is a readiness to promote the role of this structure. What could be the future of this depend very much on the future strategy of NATO strategy with respect to Russia, but it's a broader issue. If we speak about institutional aspects, Russia-NATO Council, I think it is something which could operate and could play a positive role. About Moldova. You know about Moldova. Moldovan wine. Or is it about Moldova? Or about wine? Listen, in Moldova there are some good wines. Not all of them are very good. Not all of them are of very high quality, like Georgian wines, for instance. You know, you perhaps were lucky not to have Georgian wine in Moscow because much of this wine is falsified. It's true. It's true. But listen, if we put the joke aside, or still half-jokingly, I should say Russia has reacted by some aspects of policy of Moldova by finding some bacteria in Russian wines. So on the one hand, it is something which is probably not a proper answer. On the other hand, it's much better rather than to react by using military force. We know that this could have happened if we are speaking about the past. So it's better to react in this way. Yeah, to make Ukraine a big buffer zone between Russia and Moldova, it's another very ambitious project. we could go along this line, certainly. But, you know, about what was at the origin of this. So it's a bigger issue. If we are speaking seriously, it's about the history. They decided to commemorate the date which some Russians consider is not very appropriate to do. But you know, about history, we have all the time such kind of problems. We have such kind of problems with Poland. It's a problem of history. With history in our relations with Poland, we could go back very, very far back to the history. We recently, as you know, we decided to commemorate as a big national holiday as a date which was announced, the date of withdrawing Polish forces from the Kremlin at the beginning of the 17th century. Although the date was wrong and it has never happened exactly as this date, but this was presented like that. So this was the idea of political manipulations of those who invented this. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, you know. You could believe me, this is not perceived as a kind of anti-Polish memorial date. It is just a new day off, for the Russian. So how history affects and what kind of things could be brought to our contemporary developments from history, well, it's a big debatable issue. We just recently, just several days ago, we decided to commemorate the end of the Second World War as a date of victory over Japan. So I think it was 2nd of September. Again, it was a big debate. It was a debate, and the Japanese, they reacted very cautiously because they saw that there is an anti-Japanese element in this. But on the other hand, this could be another interpretation. We used to focus upon, not so much upon the Second World War, but about what we call Great Patriotic War. The war which for my country started on the 22nd of June in 1941 and ended, contrary to all the rest of Europe, not on the 8th, but on the 9th of May. Well, exactly. But you know, coming back to this idea of celebrating the end of the Second World War as a date when Japan was defeated. So this could be interpreted as something, as the readiness of Russia to present itself as a participant in these broader things, not only Great Patriotic War, but the Second World War in general. When Second World War was finished for all the others, it was finished also for the Russians. So I think that we should be rather, how to say, cautious when speaking about the role of historical factors.
I just would like to raise one point from the paper on the strategic concept. There's a phrase which was debated among experts, but supported by consensus like everything else. And I thought that was very encouraging. And that phrase is the following one: we want to build a cooperative security order which includes security cooperation with Russia with appropriate security guarantees. And this is, I'm sure it will be reflected in the final strategy document. This is, in a certain way, a further development of the Hamel doctrine of 1967. At the peak of the Cold War, when there was total confrontation between Warsaw Pact and NATO in every way, the NATO side, after heated internal debates, said we want to go beyond defense and deterrent. We want to go to détente, to develop in Europe a stable and durable order of peace. This is, I'm sorry. Oh, this is the Polish president. Having that strategic guidance, I think will allow us to do a lot of things in the practical field of enhancing security. And when it comes to decision making, the NATO-Russia Council, please read the underlying documents, has the authority to take decisions. It has never done so. And and it seems to be that this is the case if the Russian side seizes upon these possibilities. It takes two to tango. Then we will be in business. But Russia and the United States have one thing in common which make it complicated to deal with them. They are both very powerful and big countries. And they are not yet prepared, like the European Union members, to accept that in case they disagree, we disagree among ourselves, we don't have a fight, or we go it alone, but there is a court of law which says, that's the end of it, my ruling. And I understand why it is difficult for a powerful country to do that. But this European security order defined by the European Union is, in historical terms, a tremendous process, and of course makes our security order very, very substantial.
Yes. Thank you very much. I would like to say that we approached an end of our panel discussion. I would like only to say that listening to all the panelists and the discussion, I have the feeling that in search for the response on the question behind, I would say, the new security architecture, it is the fundamental question is how to manage the change. Because we entered into the period of change, not in the period of stability, but change. How to manage the change. And this management of the change should take under consideration three elements. It is interests of national states, it is values, and power. In other words, interests, values, and power. If it is possible to reconcile all the elements in the proper way, then the new security architecture will be efficient. But at the moment, it seems to me, as rightly people said, that it is not so much the question of institution structure, but rather, I would say, the problem of political engagement and determination to use the already existing institutions. Dziękuję bardzo za uwagę i proszę przyjść punktualnie na początek sesji. Teraz jest przerwa na lunch. Dziękuję bardzo.